Hello. So, for the sake of the interview, may I ask what is your name?
My name is Larry Kinard, Kinard.
And when and where were you born?
I was born August 13th, 1928, in a small town in central Texas called Cisco, Texas. But we lived there for about 2 years, and like you, we moved early. My father worked for a company called Humble Pipeline. It's now Encore, but he worked for an oil company, and his occupation was driving a truck to haul big pipe. They were building a lot of oil pipelines in Texas at the time, so he had gotten a job with Humble Pipeline Company driving a truck and delivering pipe all over the state. So we moved to a small town in West Texas by the name of McCamey. That's Mccamey when I was 2 years old. And from
So, yeah.
that point on, we lived basically in small towns in West Texas. We moved around 3 different times because his job required that he move to change jobs. If he wanted to get a promotion in the company, he would move from town to town, and we moved from McCamey, Texas, to a small town, Wink, Texas. At that time, Wink was probably about 2,000 people. So I started school in Wink, Texas, and then when I was a freshman in high school, we moved to Odessa, which was a larger town. And I graduated from Odessa High School in 1945. I was valedictorian of our class, made good grades and studied and really enjoyed going to school. But one of the things that is interesting, we lived outside of Odessa about 15 miles, and we'd catch a bus. Several of us lived in a small pipeline camp. I called it a camp, but it was actually a nest of houses that were by the pump station. At that point, my dad was working in the pump station, helping to pump oil along one of these pipelines, and we had a village there, so we lived close to where he was working. I graduated from high school in 1945 and had a scholarship because of being a valedictorian, and decided I wanted to go to Texas A&M. So I did. I went to Texas A&M and graduated with a degree in mechanical engineering and also a commission in the U.S. Army.
Before we get into your time with the military, from my knowledge, I know that you likely grew up during a time period with the Great Depression. So, did this really affect your family in one way or another?
Well, I knew the Depression was really in 1929 to about mid 30s, I guess, 35. During that time, I was very small. Didn't know a whole lot about the effects of the Depression, but because my dad did have a job, a good job, and we lived in housing that belonged to the oil company where he worked, we did okay. And we never did really suffer much from the Depression, except we didn't have much. Most of the people that lived during that time had very little possessions. So we just enjoyed living and doing what we had. But one of the things that I remember, we didn't have TV or telephones like we have today. We had one radio in the living room, and that's where we got our news most of the time and listened to radio station WOAI out of San Antonio most of the time. So anything that we got in the way of news and information about the outside world came through that radio. And of course, during that time too, we had a lot of very, I guess, simple living. We didn't have refrigerators. We just used what they called an ice box. So you would go out and buy a big block of ice to put in the upper part of that box, and that's what you use for refrigeration. And we had lights, electricity to the houses, but it was very simply made at that time.
Right. So going back to then your decision to or after you graduated from college, what year was this again?
I graduated from college in 1949.
So did you then choose, how did you get affiliated with the military after that then?
Okay, well, you know, when I graduated, I received a commission, second lieutenant commission in the Army Reserves. And during the time I was going to school, I majored in mechanical engineering and decided to be in the artillery in the Army if I ever had to go. So I studied, we had ROTC training all 4 years that I was in A&M. And for 2 of those years, we were in what you called advanced ROTC. One of those summers, we went to a military camp for 6 weeks to learn more about the military. So during the summer between the junior and senior year, I spent 6 weeks in Fort Sill, Oklahoma, studying more about the artillery. So when I finally graduated in 1949, I left with a Bachelor of Science in Mechanical Engineering and a second lieutenant commission in the Artillery Reserves. And during that time, the first year after I got out from 1949 to 1950, I had gotten a job with a power plant, electricity generators in West Texas. And my reserve commission, all the papers were sent to a place in Midland, Texas, which was the headquarters for the U.S. Army Reserve in West Texas at the time. When the war started in 1950, the unit I was in Midland was activated. They called me one morning. I was living in a small bunkhouse, and they called me and said, "You're in the Army now." And that was about in August of 1950. And you will report immediately to the headquarters in Midland. So that's how I got in. I went in as a second lieutenant with a commission in the artillery.
So basically you decided to enlist during college, is that correct?
Decided to what?
Did you basically enlist into just the military in college, in the ROTC?
Yeah, that's when I got my basic training is through the ROTC in college.
And just to be clear, this ROTC was basically to further your education on mechanical engineering.
Well, the ROTC was to educate us on the military side. Texas A&M at that time required everyone that went to be in the ROTC. You didn't have a choice. If you were physically able, you were in the ROTC program. But the first 2 years was mandatory. The second 2 years, you actually signed a contract with the U.S. Army to say, I will do all of this, study the ROTC program. And they paid us a small amount. I think it was $30 a month or something like that to be in the ROTC program. And I liked it. I liked the military. So I enjoyed the study and was glad to be a part of it. But we wore a uniform in college every day.
Mhm.
So there you just seemed like you were in the early stages of military training.
So when your division got activated, then how did you react, and how did people around you, like your family, react?
Well, they were concerned that things that were going on in Korea at that time were not good. You know, the soldiers that were there were getting beaten up pretty good. So I didn't know. I went in for 2 years. We had a mandatory, what they call Category 4, that as a young officer, you would go in and commit to 2 years service. And they sent us to Camp Chaffee, Arkansas, to do replacement training. During that time, we had, as you probably know, we were not well equipped as far as the military and the people were concerned. So we immediately began training the draftees and those who volunteered in basic training for the Army and for combat. So I actually stayed in Camp Chaffee as an artillery officer for about a year, training replacements that were being sent to Korea.
So then what year exactly did you go to Korea then?
I didn't go to Korea until 1952.
Mhm.
Early 1952, and during all the time I was at Camp Chaffee, they kept calling officers at various times, and you just wait till you got orders to go. The rest of the time you spent in training those who were actually all the enlisted people were being sent to Korea after we finished a basic training of 16 weeks.
So upon arriving in Korea, then what exactly do you remember seeing?
We went to a school in Japan for 2 weeks. They flew us over to Japan and sent the young officers at that time to a basic, what they call the CBR school, chemical, biological, and radiologic training, because they thought at some point we may get into nuclear business or biological war. So we were trained for 2 weeks in Gifu, Japan. Then after that, we went by boat from Sasebo, Port Sasebo, across to Busan. So arriving in Busan, you know, things were still pretty hectic at that time. And we traveled from Busan to Daegu by train. And I was, you know, excited and a little bit concerned about what was going on, because they told us at the time we got on the train in Busan that they'd had some of the trains had been raided by guerrillas who were still out in the mountains in South Korea. So we had, oh, I don't know, I imagine there were 200 or 300 on the train that were riding up to Daegu, and that was where you were going to get your assignment in Daegu. So we spent about 3 days there. Didn't get to do much or look around, but as I looked across the countryside on the train, it looked pretty desolate. I mean, all I could see basically was mountains and the countryside, and we were there in early 52, so it was still pretty cold. But my impression was, you know, that it was kind of like a war-torn country and things were pretty desolate. And when we got to Daegu, though, it was just a small village and a big army. That's where 8th Army headquarters were at that time.
So what was your first assignment then once you got to Korea?
I was assigned to the 3rd Infantry Division, and that was in Seoul. The 3rd Infantry Division replacement was just outside of Seoul. They had a small camp there, and after we left Daegu, we went up to Seoul in the 3rd Division Replacement Center, and then after I was there for a couple of days, they came down from, I was going to be in C Battery. It was a 105 howitzer battery, and they came down and picked me up in a Jeep and took me up to the battery position, which was basically over close to the West Coast on the Imjin River. So my first assignment there was a forward observer with the 1st Rock Division, which at that time had a very good reputation. And so after spending a couple of days in the battery position, which was in the line, at that time, the 1st Rock Division was in the line and the 3rd Division was in reserve, but our artillery battalion supported the Rock Division because they didn't have artillery at that time. So if you were with the U.S. division and they didn't have any artillery support, the division artillery with 1 battalion supported the Rocks.
I see. And were you able to interact with any Korean citizens at that time?
No, not any, very few. I mean, we just saw in the first position we were in was at Uijeonbu, but I did see some Korean civilians around there. The small village, Uijeonbu, I understand, is a big city now, but at that time it was just very small, and the village was close to where we were stationed to begin with, but we didn't see much of them, except I saw a lot of them on the roads, and it always impressed me how much they could carry with those A-frames on their back. And a lot of them carried it on their head, walking down the roads, and sometimes a small wheelbarrow. But most of the time, what they were carrying with them was on an A-frame on their back.
Right. I've heard from a lot of stories just from my grandfather who lived during that time. He said that a lot of American soldiers would give him treats like chocolate and candy. Did,
Yes.
did you have any
Yeah.
experiences like that?
Well, one of the days while we were in the 3rd Division Replacement Center just out of Seoul, another captain and I took us, made a trip into Seoul just to see what things look like. And we saw lots of small kids, 10, 12 years old, and they lived among the ruins in Seoul. I mean, about all you could see, and what we saw when we visited there was just the remains of some buildings. And it was really devastated at that time. And the kids were living among those ruins. And anytime you'd walk down the street there, they'd all gather around you. They wanted what you had. So we did have some things. We had some small chocolates and goodies that we could give to them. And we were glad to be able to do that.
Mhm. So, in addition to the civilians, then I imagine that you worked with just other international soldiers. Do you recall? Did you have any of these sort of experiences, and do you recall any?
Well, we know the Belgians were close to us. When we were in the line with the Rocks, the Belgians and the U.S. Marines were on our flank on both sides. So mainly the ones I interacted with were the Belgians that were there, but I didn't see much of them because my time when I was in the line with the rock division was working with the company commander of the unit I was with. And we had a number of assaults by the Chinese that we had to work together on. And I spent most of my time when I was in the line first with the rock company commander and several of the platoon leaders in the rock company.
Do you have a specific memory? So just to be clear, was your role as, I guess, in your division with the artillery division, were you basically on the front lines then?
Yes.
Mhm.
Yeah, I was on the front line most of the time, at least early. When I talk about the rock division, that first rock division was Republic of Korea, and they stayed in the line for, I guess, about 2 months. And I was with them most of that time in the line along the Imjin River. So when the rocks went back in reserves themselves, then the other troops of the 3rd Division moved up into the line, and we were still along the Imjin River. And at that time, I was with the I Company of the 15th Regiment. And I then worked more with the American troops than I was with the Korean troops. But I felt very comfortable working. I had an interpreter, and you may be interested in this. His name was Sun Jae Kwon. Never will forget him. He was an interpreter between, me and the Rock Company commander, very good, and was in the Rock Navy, but he had been assigned to the 1st Rock Division as an interpreter, and he helped me out a lot.
Right. So on the front lines then, do you recall any sort of experiences with either North Korean troops or Chinese troops?
Oh, I remember I had a number of experiences when the Chinese would come across the Imjin River. Most of the time it was in the dark of night, around midnight or 2 o'clock in the morning. They tried to come up the hill, and mostly they, were well armed, and a lot of people. And the Chinese were coming up in front of where we were in the line, and several occasions they were able to we had barbed wire rolled up along in front of the trenches where we lived and where we were. And several times they got up close enough that some of them got up in the wire and were killed. And we had a lot of our own troops that were killed just because of the exchange of gunfire and the mortars and artillery they would bring in on us. So we had a number of strong assaults and battles at that time, trying to resist their taking over our position. It was always something. I mean, we got a lot of mortar rounds in on us, and you always had to stay in your bunker. And you were fortunate if the round didn't hit on top of the bunker. Sometimes it would, blow up where you were. But we had a lot that were killed by incoming mortar rounds and artillery, just like we shot artillery at them, they did to us too. So it was not a very safe place to be when we were in the line along the river.
Right. Then when you said a little bit before that you had a pretty comfortable time, if I'm not mistaken, what did you mean by like comfortable in?
Well, we had a good relationship. When we got into a combat situation or battles, I felt comfortable with my interpreter and his go-between, the company commander. That's where we did most of our communication. So I had what they call an OP, an observation post, and there I'd every day my job was to look across the river at the enemy territory. If I saw any movement, vehicles or something like that that would be a target, then I'd call in the artillery rounds on their position. And like I said, many times at night, they would try to come across the river up into our position. The big thing during that time, and this was in early 52 and up into the summer of 52, they were in the peace talks trying to settle in the end of the war, but they weren't making any progress. So mostly what was happening, the Chinese were trying to knock us off our position in the mountains. They wanted to take over where we were so they'd have more, more space into the South Korean territory. So our job was to defend a position where we were and try to keep them from doing that.
Going further into like the conditions, then what was the food like? How, in your opinion, what was the quality of the sea rations that you received?
Oh, I thought they were good. You know, mostly you'd find something. We got different kinds. We had meat patties, and sometimes we had stew and pork and beans. So when we went up there in the line, we'd tell you there was our port observer crew would be four. We'd have four people in that group. And one of them was a radio operator, the other one was the driver, and then we had an interpreter and me. And we'd bring enough of those sea rations to feed us during that time. We had a little stove that we burned sterno in to warm up the food. And I really got to where I liked the pork and beans the best. So they'd bring us they kept saying, we're going to try to bring you up one warm meal a day, but it didn't always work. But many times they'd bring us up something in the evening for a dinner meal. And the rest of the time we lived on sea ration.
I see. So before going to Korea, then, what was your general perception of Korea and just your understanding of East Asia in general?
Well, Eric, I was of the generation right after World War II that I was very patriotic. And I felt like if the government needed us, I would go. And of course, I was obligated because I had taken the ROTC and was actually in the artillery reserves. So I felt like my duty was to do what our government asked me to do. And I guess I didn't really understand all of what it was about, but I did feel like we were against communism and we didn't want to see communism take over Korea. And I studied and read enough about why we were there and what we were doing. In fact, one of my jobs at Camp Chaffee was to teach the new recruits why we were in Korea. So I felt like I knew at that time the basics and I had a good understanding of why we needed to keep our position in Asia and in the Far East. So for me personally, I supported what we were doing in Korea, though a lot of my family couldn't understand why we were doing that, why they were sending our young men over there who were killed. And at that time, a lot of them were already coming back home in caskets, and people didn't like that very much. And I guess you might say the general impression in the civilian population was we're wasting our lives and money over there when we shouldn't be there. And so President Truman was making the decision and trying to direct things at that time, and people didn't like him very much because of what he was doing. And we were glad to be, you know, I grew up in World War II and knew a lot. When I graduated from high school, I was 16, and I really thought I would, if the war wasn't over, I'd probably go into World War II. But when it ended in 1945, right after I graduated from high school, I thought the wars were over. And it was only 5 years after I graduated that the Korean War started. And I guess mentally I was okay to do that because I had what I felt like was good training and understood what was going on and why we were there. So I pretty much agreed with all of it at that time. And I had a military state of mind and thought I will do what I can to help this country. And I mean, just as another thought, I'm really glad we did what we did. I feel proud of what the U.S. did and what we contributed. And I can see, at least for what the Korean veterans did, we saved the country and people, and I'm very proud of that.
So knowing that a lot of people that I've interviewed so far have called this war an extremely controversial war. How were you received when you came back from Korea? Were people really aware, or what was their general perception?
No, you know, when I came back by ship, and I had married in December of 1950, and my wife was out there to meet me when I got off the boat. And after we got back home, a lot of people didn't know where I'd been. They said, "Where have you been?" "Well, I've been in Korea in the war over there." And a lot of people just were not interested and didn't pay attention too much because they were objecting to it. So it was just kind of in the back part of their mind anyway. It wasn't something that they felt like we needed to do. So there was very little appreciation at that time of what the veterans were doing when they came home.
So after coming back home, then what kind of occupation did you take?
I went back, I had worked a year for this utility company in the power plant. And when I came back, they still had that job waiting for me. So I just went back to the job in the power plant, and I was an engineer there that helped do various things around the plant. And I just went back in, and they welcomed me back to the job I had. So I continued with that. And actually, I worked with that company for 40 years. And when I retired from that same company.
Wow.
But I'd moved, this was in Monaghan's way out in West Texas. And I moved finally into an executive job in Fort Worth and Dallas. And to tell you the truth, I didn't think much about the war. I mean, after I came home and went back to work, I kept up with some of the people that were over there. I exchanged letters with some of them that were still in the same company where I was located, and kept up with it that way, and was glad when we finally got to the point of signing a peace treaty. But basically, from the time I got out of the service till I retired, I didn't think much about Korea or the war, and didn't realize really until, I guess, about 1995 what we had done there, and how much I appreciated what Korea had done and how much they'd grown. And my first revisit trip to Korea was in 1997, when I saw how wonderful things were and how much it had changed from the time I was there. And or since that time, as president of the National Korean Veterans Association, I've been back to Korea probably 6 times, and gone back on revisit trips and have made good friends with the people in the Sade church and so, and they've had me back. I was doing a lot of things for them besides just being a national president. I served as I guess, an honorary visitor at different times and got to work with a lot of them in that church as well as in the government.
When did you retire from your job again?
My job in 1993.
So what have you been doing since then?
Yeah, that I went in 97 and then back 5 more times, I guess, after that. Last time I went was in 2016.
Mhm. And are you currently a part of the Korean War Veterans Association?
Yes, I'm still a member. We have a local chapter in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, and we're trying to get a memorial built in Arlington Veterans Park now. We're working closely with a lot of people trying to raise funds to build a Korean memorial, and we want very much to get that done. I think we're going to be able to do it, but the virus has kept us from money raising, so we're not able to do very much right now, but we're hoping that the city of Arlington is going to help us build it.
This is the Wall of Remembrance, right?
Pardon me?
This is the Wall of Remembrance that is currently being built?
No, the Wall of Remembrance is in Washington, D.C.
Mm.
And I live in a small town just outside of Arlington, Texas. So that's where we're going to build it, in the Veterans Park in Arlington, Texas.
I see.
But I helped with the Wall of Remembrance too. I've donated to that, and I know all the people that are. Colonel Bill Weber is a good friend of mine, and Jim Fisher. And see, during the time I was president of the National Association, I very much worked with the Wall of Remembrance and worked with Bill Weber and did a number of things. So I'm very proud of that too. And do you know they've started construction on that?
Yes, I have heard that they have. They finalized the construction plans, I think a few months ago. It might have been a little bit more ago, but they have finalized the plans and they've started construction.
Yeah. I'm working with them some too, and help to get some funds for the help with the construction there. So I'm very pleased with what they're being able to do and what they are going to do.
This is the first time I've heard of the memorial that's currently being built in Arlington. Can you tell me a little bit more about what it looks like, what it's representing, etc.?
Yes, this Veterans Park in Arlington, Texas, already has a World War II memorial and a Vietnam memorial, and the city of Arlington had enough space there for a Korean memorial, so they came to us and said, would you help, or would you like to help build a Korean memorial there? We said, yes, very much. So the memorial itself is going to consist of some marble slabs and a statue of a figure of a soldier in the middle with brick around the bottom of that, and a number of kiosks in particular that have some educational material and some videos that people who visit there can go by and look at information about the war. I went over there yesterday, and yesterday was a beautiful day here. Sun shining, and a lot of people were out with their families and walking around among those other memorials. So I think this is an excellent place for us to have an educational kiosk for people to look at. And it's going to be, we have several marble slabs, and one of the things that we have just done, the Sade Church has bought one of those marble slabs that will have a peninsula of Korea on it with some inscriptions about the war.
So how can people donate to this cause then? Are the funds completely funded, or?
Oh no, we're a long way. It's going to cost about $500,000, and we're just really beginning. But the city of Arlington said they would like to contribute to it. So we have a website, Chapter 215 Korean Veterans, that you can donate to into the city of Arlington.
All right. I think that's all the questions that I have for today. Thank you so much for this interview.
Eric, I'm very glad to meet you and appreciate your interest in all of this and the Korean War. And remember that freedom is not free. My sole basis for a lot of the things that I've done since I retired and found out about the Korean Veterans Association is to go into the schools. We visit a lot of the schools in the US and talk to the students about the Korean War, but the predominant theme is that freedom is not free. You need to remember you've got to defend it, and there are times when it's threatened. And even in our country today, we have people that don't understand what the veterans have done. World War II and Vietnam and Korean War, we're all, in my view, part of defending the freedom that we have and the freedom in South Korea. You have your freedom because of what we did, and I'm glad we helped to do that.
All right. Well, thank you so much for your time
Eric,
and this interview.
good luck to you.
Right.
Enjoyed being with you.
I hope you stay safe and make sure to sanitize during the pandemic. And I hope that I can hear from you again sometime soon.
Okay, me too.
All right. Thank you so much.
Bye.
Bye.
All right.